The sword hit the marble floor before anyone understood what was happening. It slid across the stone with a sound like a dying breath, spinning once, twice, then coming to rest at the foot of the throne. Every minister in the royal court stopped breathing. The king sat forward on his throne, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on his son. Prince Han Mu-jin stood in the center of the court, dressed in full battle armor. Iron pauldrons still dusted from the road. War paint faded, but visible on his jaw. He had not changed. He had not bathed. He had ridden through the night to get here, and every man in that room could see it. He had come prepared for war, with his own father. "If she dies," Mu-jin said, his voice low and absolute, the kind of voice that had once ordered cavalry charges across frozen rivers, "I renounce my title. I leave this kingdom, and everything I have built for Goguryeo, I take with me." The court exploded. Ministers shouted over one another. Generals grabbed the arms of younger officers to keep them from drawing steel. Lady Sehua, standing to the left of the throne in her silk robes, went completely still, her face a mask, but her hands gripping each other so tightly her knuckles turned white. And in the corner of the court, surrounded by royal guards, stood a woman who had not moved since the chaos began. Her name was Zuri. She was not noble. She was not Goguryeo. She wore servant's clothes. Her wrists bore the faint marks of old rope, and she stood in that corner with her chin lifted and her eyes steady, watching the prince she had never asked to save her life, prepare to destroy his own for hers. She had told him not to come. He had come anyway. This is the story of how a ruthless prince fell in love with a woman the entire kingdom told him he could not have. How a foreign scholar held up the walls of an empire she did not belong to. And how the greatest battle Han Mu-jin ever fought was not on a battlefield, but inside the court of his own father. 3 years earlier, the name Han Mu-jin made grown men reconsider their life choices. He was 26 when he broke the siege at Hyunsan Pass with fewer than 800 cavalry against an enemy force of nearly 5,000. He didn't use a clever ambush. He didn't wait for reinforcements. He simply rode straight at the enemy's center before dawn, in complete silence, and hit them so hard and so fast that by the time the sun rose, the pass was clear and his soldiers were eating the enemy's morning rice. His own generals called it reckless. He called it efficient. The king called it exactly what Goguryeo needed, because Goguryeo was not at peace. It never truly was. The northern tribes raided border villages every winter. The Eastern Coalition had been testing the kingdom's edges for 2 years. And within the palace itself, noble families played their quiet games of influence and succession, each one maneuvering for position in a kingdom they expected to outlast the king. Mu-jin understood all of this. He simply did not care about any of it, except the parts he could solve with movement and force. He was not cruel. That was the misunderstanding most people made about him. He did not enjoy suffering. He simply refused to let emotions slow down a decision that needed to be made. When soldiers under his command were caught stealing from villagers, he didn't rage or lecture. He had them stripped of rank, handed a laborer's tool, and assigned to rebuild the homes they had stolen from. When a subordinate general lost 300 men to a preventable ambush, Mu-jin didn't humiliate him publicly. He sat with him in his tent for 2 hours and made him explain every decision, step by step, until the man understood where it had gone wrong. He was not cold. He was focused. The distinction mattered to him, even if no one else saw it. What he could not do, what he had never been able to do, was pretend to feel things he didn't. And when his father summoned him to the throne room 6 months after the victory at Hyunsan and introduced him to Lady Sohwa, the eldest daughter of the Sohwa clan, and told him this was his future queen, Mu-jin looked at the woman, beautiful, composed, clearly intelligent, from one of the most powerful families in the kingdom, and felt absolutely nothing. He bowed. He said the correct words. He attended the engagement ceremony and wore the royal ring, and stood beside her at the banquet, while ministers toasted their union, and his father smiled, for the first time in months. And then he went back to his quarters, sat alone in the dark for a long time, and tried to find one genuine feeling inside his chest. He found duty. That would have to be enough. Zuri had not planned to end up in Goguryeo. She had not planned to end up anywhere except home. She was 23 when the political conflict tore through her kingdom in the west of the continent, a betrayal between allied royal houses that turned into bloodshed faster than anyone anticipated. She had been part of the royal scholarly circle, trained from childhood in astronomy, agricultural science, military logistics, medicine, and 4 languages. Her mind was the thing her people valued most about her. Her mother had told her since childhood that a sharp mind was the only possession no one could take away. Her mother had never met slave traders. The ship that took her across the sea was destroyed in a storm 3 weeks into the journey. She survived by clinging to wreckage for 2 days until a fishing vessel pulled her from the water. The fishermen took her to a trading port. The trading port eventually led, through a series of transactions she had no power over, to the palace of Goguryeo, where she was sold into household service and assigned to the kitchens. The first thing the other servants told her was to stay quiet and invisible. The second thing they told her was not to look the nobles directly in the eyes. The third thing was that a foreign woman with her appearance would attract the wrong kind of attention from the wrong kind of men, and she should make herself small and useful and unremarkable in every possible way. Zuri listened to all of this politely. Then she continued being exactly who she was. She could not help it. When she overheard 2 stewards arguing about why the eastern crop yield had dropped 3 seasons in a row, she told them about soil rotation patterns she had studied in her homeland. They ignored her. The following spring, the yield dropped again. The season after that, one of the stewards quietly tried what she had said. The yield recovered. He never thanked her. She didn't need him to. When a fever swept through the servant quarters and the palace physician prescribed treatments that weren't working, she spent 3 nights awake, identifying the pathogen pattern from the symptoms, and suggested a different approach using compounds she found in the kitchen stores. The physician refused to listen. She made the preparation anyway and gave it to the sick servants herself, quietly, without permission. Most of them recovered within 4 days. The physician told everyone it was his new treatment plan. She said nothing. She was learning that in a place where no one expected her to have value, the safest way to exercise power was to let other people believe it was theirs. She was not invisible. She was patient. The military campaign in the Northern Corridor began in early spring of the 2nd year of the royal engagement. Mujin had been given command of a 3-pronged supply operation to support the forward battalions pushing back the tribal raids. It should have been straightforward. He had done more complex operations with fewer resources. But 3 weeks in, the supply lines began to fail in ways that made no logical sense. Roads that the scouts had confirmed were clear became impassable after minor rainfall. Not because of the rain itself, but because of the way the routes had been planned through low-drainage valley floors. Supply wagons were taking twice the expected time. Horses were dying from poor feed allocation. Soldiers at the front were getting food every 3rd day instead of every day. Mujin had called 3 consecutive strategy meetings and gotten 3 sets of answers that all pointed to different problems. His generals were competent men. They were looking at individual parts and seeing individual failures. None of them were seeing the system. He was riding back from the 2nd forward position when his escort passed a supply column moving too slowly through a valley pass. He almost kept riding. Then he noticed one of the supply workers, a palace servant reassigned to the campaign, a woman he recognized vaguely from somewhere, standing still beside a halted wagon, looking at the road ahead of her with an expression he recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who had already solved the problem and was deciding whether to say so. He pulled his horse to a stop. "You," he pointed at her. "What are you seeing?" The soldiers around her looked at one another. The woman looked up at him slowly, without flinching, which was itself unusual. "The route," she said. "It runs through 3 valley floors in sequence. Every time it rains, surface water from the hills drains into those floors. The road becomes soft. The wagons sink. It doesn't matter how fast the drivers push. The ground itself is the problem." Mujin stared at her. "And," he said, because there was clearly an and. "There's a ridge path 2 lie east. It runs longer, but it's elevated shale, drains naturally, solid footing in any weather. If the supply columns switch to that route, travel time actually decreases because the ground doesn't work against the wagons." His senior general rode up beside him. My lord, she's a kitchen servant. She just described the problem more clearly than anyone in my last 3 strategy meetings, Mu Jin said flatly. He looked at Zuri again. How do you know the ridge path? I walked it, she said simply. I walk whenever I can. It helps me think. He was quiet for a moment. Come with me, he said. She rode beside him to the command tent. Not behind, beside. His officers said nothing, but he felt their discomfort like a physical thing in the air. He ignored it. Inside the tent, he spread the campaign maps across the table and told her to show him everything she had seen. She did. Not nervously, not with the apologetic hedging of someone seeking approval. She moved across the maps with precision, pointing out drainage patterns, forage zones for the horses, the locations where the enemy tribes historically positioned observation posts, a river crossing 2 days west that would save significant time if used correctly. She spoke for 40 minutes without stopping. When she finished, Mu Jin stood back and looked at the maps with new eyes. Where did you learn military logistics? He asked. In my country, military strategy and agricultural science were part of the same discipline, she said. You cannot sustain an army without sustaining the land that feeds it. They are the same problem. He had never heard anyone say that before. He had also never been more immediately certain that something he was hearing was true. What's your name? He said. Zuri. Zuri. He said it once, like he was filing it somewhere specific. I'm going to implement everything you've shown me. If it works, you're not going back to the kitchens. She met his eyes without looking away. And if it doesn't work, then I'll admit I was wrong, which I also don't do often. So you should hope it works. For the first time since he had met her, she almost smiled. It worked. Within 2 weeks, the supply lines were running at twice their previous efficiency. The forward battalions were fed, the horses were healthy, and the campaign that had been quietly edging toward failure suddenly found its momentum again. Mu Jin sent her to work alongside his chief logistics officer, then alongside his chief physician when she mentioned she had medical training. Then he began summoning her to the command tent in the evenings, not for any specific task, but because he had found that conversations with her clarified his thinking in a way that nothing else did. She argued with him. That was the part he hadn't expected. Not rudely, not carelessly, but she disagreed with him when she thought he was wrong, and she explained why, and she didn't back down when he pushed back, and she didn't celebrate when he eventually admitted she had a point. She simply moved on to the next problem, as if his rank was relevant to the conversation only when it was relevant to the problem. No one had ever treated him that way. Not his generals, who deferred even when they disagreed. Not his father, who trusted him but always kept a layer of royal authority between them. Not the court scholars, who packaged every difficult truth in enough layers of courtesy that the truth itself sometimes got lost. Zuri told him things directly, including things he didn't want to hear. Your cavalry charge at Hyunsan was brilliant, she told him one evening, when he was describing the battle with the unself-conscious pride of a man who had earned it. It was also a strategy that only works because your enemies don't expect it from you yet. The third time you do it, they will. You need a different approach for the next major engagement. He had stared at her for a long moment. You're saying I've been relying on the element of surprise. I'm saying your reputation for recklessness has become a predictable weapon, she said. Predictable weapons get countered. He sat with that for 3 days before admitting she was right. By the end of the campaign, he had stopped thinking of her as a servant he was consulting. He was not fully sure what he was thinking of her as, but the ride back to the capital felt shorter than usual, and he spent most of it in conversation with her. And when they arrived at the palace gates, and she was separated from his party and sent back to the servant quarters, he sat in his chambers that night with a feeling he didn't immediately recognize. It took him until morning to name it. He missed talking to her. That had never happened to him before, with anyone. The months that followed changed the atmosphere of the palace in ways that were difficult to name at first, but impossible to ignore once you knew what you were looking at. Prince Mu Jin began requesting Zuri's presence in his strategy sessions. Formally through the palace administration, she was officially reassigned from the kitchens to the prince's advisory staff, a position that had no established precedent for a foreign servant woman, and that required the prince to create the role specifically for her, which he did without apparent concern for what that meant. He began appearing less burdened in the evenings. Servants who had attended him for years noticed that he stayed awake later, talking, and that his quarters sometimes carried the sound of genuine laughter, quiet, surprised laughter, the kind that happens when someone says something you didn't see coming. He brought her arguments to the War Council, not as a servant suggested this, but as, "This is the analysis," presenting her strategic thinking as simply the correct view, which it usually was. And he stopped wearing the royal engagement ring on days when he was not required to be seen in public. Lady Sohwa noticed all of it. She was not a foolish woman. That was important to understand about her. She had been raised by a father who treated political power as the only currency worth accumulating. And she had been trained from girlhood to read rooms, read faces, read the invisible architecture of influence that held royal courts together. She had been selected as the prince's bride, not simply because of her family's power, but because she was genuinely capable, sharp, composed, politically fluent, in ways that most men in the court were not. She had accepted the engagement with clear eyes. She did not expect love from Mu Jin. She had not expected warmth. She had expected respect, shared purpose, and the kind of partnership that powerful political unions sometimes became over time. She had not expected a kitchen servant from across the sea to make the prince forget she existed. The first time she arranged to encounter Zuri directly, she did it in the garden, casually, with two of her attendants present, in a way that could not be called confrontational. "You're the foreign woman my betrothed finds so fascinating," she said. Zuri stopped walking. She looked at Sohwa with those steady, unreadable eyes that everyone who dealt with her eventually learned to find unsettling. "I serve as an advisor to the prince's strategic staff. My lady, you serve as a kitchen worker elevated beyond your station," Sohwa said pleasantly. "I'm curious what you imagine the future holds for you here." "I imagine it holds the same thing it always has," Zuri said. "Work, problems to solve, whatever the kingdom needs." She bowed correctly and left. Seohwa watched her go, and something settled in her chest that she chose not to examine too closely, because examining it would have required naming it, and the name was not something a future queen could afford. The conspiracy took shape over 2 months. Seohwa was careful. She did not act from rage. She assembled it methodically, the way her father had taught her to assemble political arguments. Find the vulnerability, build the evidence around it, present it at the moment of maximum impact. The vulnerability was obvious. Zuri was foreign. She had come from nowhere, with no verified history, no family connections, no noble patron. She had access to military intelligence, supply routes, campaign strategies. In a kingdom that was under sustained external threat, the distance between foreign woman in the War Council and foreign spy with access to military intelligence was not large if you were motivated to close it. Seohwa found 3 servants willing to testify that they had seen Zuri pass information to a foreign merchant at the Eastern Market. She found a court official who was willing to suggest that certain intelligence failures during the border raids could be traced to the period when Zuri had been active in the military logistics operation. She found a palace record keeper who could produce a document, freshly created, though it would not look that way, that appeared to show Zuri's original sale into palace service was arranged by an enemy state intermediary. It was not a perfect conspiracy, but it did not need to be perfect. It needed to be convincing enough that the court would demand action before anyone looked too closely. She presented it to the king's chief minister on a Thursday morning. By Thursday evening, Zuri had been placed under arrest. The charges spread through the palace like fire through dry grass. Foreign spy, enemy agent, traitor to the crown. By the following morning, half the court had already decided she was guilty, because the story fit a shape they had always been ready to believe, that a foreign woman with too much access to power had been using that access for something sinister. Nobody paused to ask why a spy who was successfully feeding intelligence to the enemy would have spent 2 years making Goguryeo's military operations more efficient. Nobody paused to ask very much at all. Mu Jin was in the northern garrison when the messenger reached him. He read the document once, then he read it again. Then he sat very still for approximately 30 seconds, which was 29 seconds longer than he usually sat still after receiving bad news. Then he called for his horse. His second-in-command caught up with him at the garrison gate. "My lord, if you ride now, at this speed, the court will see it as—" "I know what the court will see it as," Mu Jin said. "Then perhaps you should wait for—" "She saved this army," he said, and the quiet force in his voice stopped the other man completely. "She saved this army, and she saved my sister, and she has given 2 years of her mind and her life to a kingdom that was not hers. And I am not going to sit in a garrison and wait while they execute her for it." He rode through the night. If you've been watching this far and this story is gripping you, drop a comment right now. Tell me what you think Mu Jin is about to do. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Stories like this come every week. He arrived at dawn. He did not go to his chambers to change. He did not send a message ahead. He walked directly into the throne room in his road-dusted armor, and he drew his sword, and he placed it on the floor, and he said the words that stopped an entire court mid-breath. "If she dies, I renounce my title. I leave this kingdom, and everything I have built for Goguryeo, I take with me." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock alone. It was the silence of calculation. Every minister, every general, every court official, suddenly running the numbers of what it would mean if the kingdom's most effective military commander walked away. The northern tribes would know within weeks. The eastern coalition would move within months. The careful security Mu Jin had spent 7 years building would begin to unravel. The king looked at his son for a long moment. "You would destroy your legacy," he said. "For a servant woman." "I would destroy nothing," Mu Jin said. "I would simply leave. The destruction would belong to the people who made it necessary." Lady Sohwa stepped forward. Her voice was perfectly controlled. "My Lord Prince, the evidence against this woman is clear. She is a foreign national who has had access to classified military strategy. The testimony against her was purchased," Mu Jin said. He turned and looked at Sohwa directly, and something in his expression made her stop speaking. "I know what was done. I know how it was done, and I know why." The court went very still. "I have no proof of that claim, my lord," Sohwa said carefully. "Not yet," he said, "but I'm patient." It was the old palace healer who changed everything. She was 81 years old, and she had been in the palace longer than the king himself, and she had spent her entire career watching powerful people make terrible decisions with absolute certainty. She had seen plagues and famines and political betrayals and succession wars. She had kept quiet through most of it, because keeping quiet was how you survived long enough to be 81. But she had also watched a young foreign woman work through 3 nights without sleeping to save the servant quarters from a fever that should have killed half of them. And she had watched, 4 months before that, a different kind of fever. The kind that had taken 2 royal children before their 5th birthdays. Come for the king's youngest daughter, Princess Haun. She had watched Zuri identify the fever pattern in its 2nd day, when the palace physicians were still uncertain of what they were dealing with. She had watched her prepare the compound from kitchen herbs and filtered water, and one ingredient the royal pharmacist had dismissed as irrelevant. She had watched Haun's fever break on the 4th day, when it should have killed her on the 3rd. She had kept quiet then, because Zuri had asked her to. Because Zuri had understood, even at that moment, that a foreign servant taking credit for saving the princess would create more political danger than it resolved. She stood up in the court now, and her voice, though old, carried. "I have something to say." The silence was absolute as she spoke. She described the fever. She described the treatment. She described watching Zuri work in the princess's chambers through the night, the compound she had prepared, the moment the fever broke. She described how Zuri had made her swear not to tell anyone. "I kept that promise for 2 years, the old woman said. "I am breaking it now because the alternative is watching this court execute the woman who saved our princess. And I am too old to watch that and stay silent." The king did not move for a very long time. Then, slowly, he turned to look at the doors at the far side of the court. "Bring Princess Ha-eun," he said quietly. Ha-eun was 17. She was small and serious, and had her brother's eyes. She walked into the court with the composure of someone who had been told what was happening and had decided exactly what she was going to do about it. She walked past the ministers, past the generals, past Lady Seohwa, who watched her with an expression that had finally, completely, lost its composure. She walked to where Zuri stood, between the royal guards, and she took Zuri's hands in both of hers. "She saved my life," Ha-un said to the court, loudly, clearly, turning to face them with her chin up. "I was 9 years old, and the fever had been in me for 3 days, and the physicians told my father to prepare for the worst. And this woman stayed in my chambers through the night and brought me back. She did not ask for anything. She did not want recognition. She only wanted me to live." Ha-un turned to the king. "Father, if this woman is guilty of treason, then treason is the reason I am standing here, and I will not accept that." The conspiracy collapsed within hours. One of the false witnesses broke under direct questioning from the king's minister. Not because of threat or force, but because standing in a room where the princess had just testified made the lie feel like a physical weight he couldn't carry. He named Seohwa's intermediary. The intermediary named the others. The forged document was identified by the palace archivist, who had been suspicious of it from the beginning, but had been afraid to say so. Lady Seohwa stood in the center of all of it, and did not deny what she had done. She was not a woman built for denial. She was built for power, and the power had run out. "I did what I believed was necessary," she said to the king, and her voice barely trembled, "to protect what was mine." "It was never yours," the king said, and his voice was not cruel, only tired. And neither was he. The engagement was dissolved. The Seo family's role in the conspiracy was formally investigated. The noble families who had supported the charges against Zuri began, quietly, to recalculate their positions. Mu-jin did not watch any of this. He was standing outside the court, in the corridor, where Zuri had been brought after the guards released her. They were alone for the first time since before the campaign. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical strain, but from having held yourself completely still under enormous pressure for a very long time. He stood 2 feet away from her and looked at her for a moment. "You told me not to come," he said. "I did," she said. "I came anyway. I know." A pause. "You could have lost everything." "I know that too." She looked at him. This man who had ridden through the night in battle armor, who had laid his sword at his father's feet, who had been prepared to walk away from his kingdom and his crown and his legacy for a woman the court called a servant. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, because he wanted to say it correctly. "Because some things are worth more than the throne," he said. "I spent my whole life believing that power was the point, that conquest was the point. You showed me that wasn't true, not by telling me, by being exactly who you are in every room you walk into." He took 1 step toward her. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I've never done this, but I know I don't want to do whatever comes next without you beside me." She didn't answer immediately. She had learned, in 2 years, that Mu-jin didn't make statements he didn't mean. He had no patience for performance. "You're still a prince," she said. "And I'm still the woman who saved my army," he said. "The woman who saved my sister. The woman who is the sharpest mind I've ever encountered in any room, in any kingdom." He held her gaze. "Whatever title comes next, we'll find it." For the first time in 2 years, she let herself feel something she had kept carefully contained in a room inside herself with the door locked. It felt like relief and warmth, and something that didn't yet have a name but was on its way to getting one. "Okay," she said simply. He almost smiled. The noble families did not accept the change quietly. 3 of the most powerful clans formally withdrew their support from the crown, citing the broken engagement, the public humiliation of the Seo family, and the presence of a foreign woman in the prince's inner circle. They began negotiating with each other, and those negotiations, as the king's intelligence network confirmed within 2 weeks, were moving toward coordinated armed resistance. Civil war. The word moved through the palace like smoke under doors, slow, invisible, and everywhere at once. Mu-jin had spent his career fighting external enemies. He understood external enemies. They had clear positions, clear motivations, clear pressure points. Fighting a civil war meant fighting people he had eaten with, trained with, whose fathers had served alongside his father. It required a different kind of strategy entirely. Zuri understood internal conflicts. Her home kingdom had been destroyed by one. They worked through 3 nights together, mapping out the clan loyalties, the economic dependencies that bound the rebel families to the crown's trade networks, the personal rivalries between the three clan leaders that would, under sufficient pressure, prevent them from staying coordinated. She identified two clan elders, not leaders, elders, older figures with cultural authority, who were uncomfortable with the rebellion, but hadn't yet spoken against it publicly. She outlined what it would take to give them a reason to speak. Mu-jin handled the military positioning. She handled the political architecture. They moved like two people who had spent years learning how the other one thought, because they had. The rebellion collapsed before it became a war, not because of superior force, because of superior understanding. One of the targeted elders publicly withdrew his clan's support from the coalition. The second followed within a day. The three clan leaders, suddenly facing a fragmented alliance and a prince who had not moved a single soldier aggressively, found themselves negotiating terms rather than issuing ultimatums. It was the most complete victory Mu-jin had ever won. He had not drawn a sword. 4 years later, the king died in the way old kings die, when the kingdom has been at peace long enough, slowly, with his affairs in order, with his son at his bedside and his daughter holding his hand. Han Mu-jin was crowned in the Great Hall of Goguryeo on a morning in early spring. He wore the crown without visible emotion, the way he did most things, but those who had known him long enough saw something different in him that day. A settledness, the look of a man who had finally arrived somewhere he recognized. Beside him, in a formal position that had been specifically created for her, not a queen's position, because Zuri had asked, quietly, not to navigate that political battle before the kingdom was ready, but a position with real power, real authority, real recognition, stood Zuri. She wore deep blue, which was the color of the Goguryeo advisory rank. Her title was one Mu-jin had created, Royal Strategic Council. Not a servant's title, not a concubine's title, a title that meant exactly what it said. She was the king's counsel. She was the mind behind the throne. And everyone in that hall knew it. The speech Mu-jin gave at the coronation was not long. He had never been a man for long speeches, but one part of it was written down and repeated for generations afterward. He said, "A kingdom is only as strong as its willingness to recognize where wisdom lives. Wisdom does not always come dressed in silk. It does not always speak the same language as its king. It does not always arrive through the gates we expect. Our greatest enemies in this kingdom have not been the tribes at our borders. They have been our own certainties, our own refusal to see what was standing right in front of us." He did not look at Zuri when he said it. He didn't need to. Every person in that hall looked at her. History is strange in the way it remembers people. The records of Goguryeo from that era are incomplete. Many were lost, but the ones that survive mention, repeatedly, a figure referred to in various texts as the foreign counselor, the woman of the West, or simply the king's strategist. She appears in military records, agricultural records, medical records, and diplomatic correspondence. She is mentioned in the memoirs of 3 different court ministers, all of whom describe her in language that makes clear they understood, even at the time, that they were watching something unusual. One of the ministers wrote, late in his life, "She was not what we expected. None of us were ready for her." I think that was the point. Zuri lived to be 67. She outlived the king by 4 years. In those 4 years, she completed a written compendium of agricultural and medical knowledge, combining what she had learned in her homeland with what she had observed in Goguryeo, that palace scholars were still copying and distributing 200 years after her death. She never returned to her homeland. When asked about this, in the only recorded personal account she gave, she said, "Home is not always where you were born. Sometimes, it is where you were finally allowed to be completely yourself." And somewhere between a frozen garrison and a royal court, between a campaign map and a candlelit tent, between a prince who had never needed anyone and a woman who had survived everything, something had grown. Quiet, unasked for, inconvenient for everyone, but real, the realest thing either of them had ever built. If this story moved you, if Zuri's strength, Mu-jin's courage, or that moment in the corridor hit you the way it was meant to, this channel needs you right now. Subscribe so you never miss a story. Leave a comment telling me which scene stayed with you longest, and like this video so more people find stories worth watching. because the next one is already coming, and it is not a story you want to miss.